Hi everyone, welcome to this video on compiler design. In this video, we are going to discuss particularly on the introduction to compilers. Let us dive into the video. What do you infer from this picture? There are two persons from two different countries willing to communicate each other, where the person one knows language from his or her own country, while the person two knows only the language from his or her own country. In such scenario, there is a need for a translating person in between because they don't know each other country's language. What is the property to be held by the translating person? The person must know the language from country 1 as well as from the country 2. Only then he or she will be able to better translate from language 1 to language 2 and translate the same or communicate the same to each other persons. I think we have understood what is the need for translators in regular languages. Look at this picture too. What do we infer from this picture? There is a newsreader reading the news, and while parallelly the sign language person giving the sign to the deaf and dumb people. The news reading and sign language both go hand in hand. Only then the deaf and dumb people can catch the message correctly. And now let us dive into what is the need for translators in computer languages. What is the need? Probably we need two type of translators, and we have two types of translators in computer field. One is called the interpreter, another one is called the compiler. Let us understand what are each. A compiler is a computer program that transforms the source code written in a programming language into another computer language, often having a binary form known as the object code. It is the most common reason for wanting to transform the source code is to create an executable program. Normally, we humans write programs in high-level languages that must be understood by the machine in low-level language. And there is a gap between the high-level language to the low-level language and the language understood by the humans and the language understood by the machines. And hence, there is a need for translator in between. One such translator is the compiler. And what is interpreter? Interpreter in terms of computing is a computer program that reads the source code of another computer program and executes them directly. Let us understand the difference between the compiler and interpreter at first. The previous slide says that the compiler compiles the source program while the interpreter executes the source program. That is the first and foremost difference between the compiler and the interpreter. Let us look into the 2 points highlighted here. It is interpreted line by line, but it is the slower way of running the program when compared to that of the compiler. That is why I correlated both of the example pictures in the respective slides where the interpretation matches with the news reading and where the traditional compilation matches with the traditional translating person translating each other country's language. Because interpreter takes the first line of a program, transforms it, executes, takes the second line, transforms, executes, takes the third line, transforms, executes, and keeps on going. And that is why interpreter is set to execute the program line by line. The interpreter stops when there is an error. Similarly, when the news reader is reading the news and when he or she mistakenly spoke a word, probably the sign language person will also get disturbed and the sign language gets disturbed, probably. And similarly, when an interpreter gets an error, it stops its execution and reports the error to the user. Until it finds an error, the interpreter keeps on executing the statements. Let us look at the complete differences between compiler versus interpreter. Source program is fed into the compiler. The compiler will give you the executable program. Now, the compiler will also indicate if there are errors. Compiler compiles the source program entirely together, all statements together. But it will not give you the executable program unless there are no errors. It will indicate the errors as and when, and the user or the programmer has to clear all the errors in order to get the executable program. And let us look into the next step. Once the executable program is ready by the compiler, the data or input can be fed to the executable program, which would probably generate the expected output. In order to get executable program in the first step, the program must be free of errors. That must be understood, because compiler does not directly execute the program. Compiler merely translates the program into an executable program without errors. This is the flow of compilers. And when it comes to an interpreter, source program along with data both are given together to the interpreter, which will give the expected output, or it will indicate if there are errors, which must be well noted. And these are the differences between compiler and interpreter in written form. Let us look into the point 1. Compiler translates the source program into an executable program, probably the machine readable program, at a stretch. Whereas an interpreter converts a source program and executes it at the same time. Compiler doesn't execute directly, while the interpreter executes directly. Point 2. Compiles all the statements together. It is a whole compilation. Whereas the interpreter executes or interprets each statement separately, line by line. And whereas the third point states that input is given only to the executable file in terms of a compiler, whereas the interpreter takes source program as well as the input together. In terms of memory and space, let us discuss. A compiler requires more space because it requires objects codes to be generated, whereas interpreter requires only less amount of memory. It doesn't require any space for intermediate code because it directly executes. In terms of time, the compiler executes faster, but the interpreter executes a little slower compared to the compiler, because you have the executable program in hand in terms of compiler, whereas interpreter transforms, executes, transforms, executes, transforms, executes, line by line, line by line, line by line. And hence, probably the translator called interpreter is slower when compared to compiler. Few example languages are listed. Fortran, COBOL, C, C++, Pascal, etc. are all examples of compiled languages, while Lisp, Perl, Python, etc. are all the examples of interpreted languages. Now let us discuss what are the probable classifications of compilers. So, based on the construction and functional behavior, there are 4 classifications of compilers: single pass, multipass, load and go, debugging, and optimizing compilers. The first 3 are purely based on how they are constructed, while the last is based on the functionality of the compiler. Whether the source program is compiled as whole or whether the compilation happens in a single step depends on the first 3 category, or based on the construction. Whether the compilation happens in single step, multi-step, or multiple phases is depending on the first 3 categories, while the debugging and optimizing compiler is based on the functionality. We could see from the recent compilers and integrated development environments, it will not create or allow the users to have syntactical errors. The compilers itself help us to place the brackets automatically, opening and closing brackets in terms of if, while, and whatsoever. Those compilers help us to place automatically opening and closing parentheses, so the user will not probably have any syntactical errors. Those kind of compilers or integrated development environments are called debugging and optimizing compilers. So the basic tasks that any compiler must perform are essentially the same. But by understanding these tasks, we can construct compilers for a wide variety of source languages and target machines using the same basic techniques, and that is why these classifications are. However, the compiler must perform fundamentally the same task of converting source language into machine language so that the machine understands what the user tries to say. Thank you for watching this video on introduction to compilers. Let us continue with next video.